This will be fun. Now, let's just be clear on the process here because everybody wants to see behind the curtain. Paul, you and Brian did the House. Is this correct?
Yes.
And Sonia and Erica did the Senate. Yes. So we'll direct questions on the House to you guys and to the Senate on you guys.
House is a lot more fun.
Well, okay.
So take that, Senate people.
Yeah.
That's entirely fair.
I want to ask Paul, just sort of as a way to set the table for this conversation, the old process versus outcomes question. You and I had a version of this question every 2 years going back to the beginning of time. Is inclusion on the list either as a best or a worst based on process, that is to say, the degree to which a member works well or does not work well within the legislative process, within the system, or is it about outcomes? Member passes a bad bill, member passes a good bill, Texas is better for their work, and therefore they either get included or dinged. Which is it, process or outcomes?
Well, you see both on the list represented.
Right.
I think we have to be agnostic about what is good and what is bad in terms of bills, for example. We try not to do that. What we try to do is how do you play on the playground? That's sort of the that's sort of the test.
In fact, the intro the story is not yet published. You all don't have the benefit, as I have had, of having the actual story and the actual write-ups. In the actual story, as is the case every year, Brian, the introduction specifies the criteria for inclusion.
Right.
And I'm distilling what is obviously more than just this sentence, but it says, success in politics is all about how well one plays with others, who is fair, who is trustworthy, who offers help to his colleagues. That actually sounds like it's a little bit more tilted to the process side.
Well, again, I think it's a blend. I mean, I think our notion of coming at this is trying to look at, are people looking to build coalitions? Are they looking to solve problems in sort of honest and fair ways?
Right.
And are they doing it in ways, I think, that brings respect and honor to the process? Is it transparent? Is it fair?
Right.
And I think it's hard to put anything together. I mean, first of all, so we released the list, as most of you know, yesterday at noon. We're thrilled by the unbelievable unanimous response that everybody thinks it's perfect. It's really been heartening, you know. But the notion of putting out any list is that some people are going to find some stuff on it that they like, some people are going to find some stuff on it that they hate, and nobody is going to think that it's perfect. And so I think the only way for us to feel good about the list is to remain true to the criteria that we put forth.
Right.
And in that sense, I think it is more about personality and how one performs and handles him or herself, as opposed to ideology or anything along those lines.
Now, we've got 20 people on the best and worst list combined, and we don't have a whole lot of time here. We have just about 35 minutes, so I don't know that we're going to get to every single person, but there are certainly some themes that emerge and some categories of observations that I want to start off with, if that's okay. Beginning with the fact that, like the 2/3 rule, it's not actually a rule, it's a tradition. Over time, there has been a tendency not to put leadership on the best list or on the worst list. And of course, having said that, I went back last night very proud of myself, thinking, well, they never do that. Right. And I noticed that back in 11, you put Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst on the worst list.
David Dewhurst was on the worst list.
Back in 2007, you put both Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst and Governor Perry on the worst list. So throw out the idea that you don't put leadership on the list. But this year, you actually put Speaker Straus on the best list, and you put a non-legislator, Susan Combs, the Comptroller, on the worst list. I'm tempted to ask you, which part of best and worst legislators don't you understand? But you obviously believe that her contribution, Erica, I'll ask you about this. Her contribution to the session in the negative sense warranted the unusual inclusion of a non-legislator on the list.
I think we were all totally agreed on that. She had an unusually disproportionately malignant effect on not just this session, but the previous one too. And you know, obviously this session was starting off in a better place because we had this surplus, but it was basically an accident of her projections and maybe of her failure to kind of having made these bad projections to come back and tell people that. So, I mean, you start out thinking in 2011, the Ledge cut public education by $5.4 billion by accident because of bad math. I mean, and that, I think, cast a pall.
Well, by accident on purpose.
Depending on how cynical you want to be about it, and you know.
Plenty. How about that? How about I start with plenty cynical? I mean, the fact is that it was a choice that was made. It was made on the basis of the information at the time. In defense of the Comptroller, she's not the first Comptroller to blow a revenue estimate, and she surely won't be the last.
She is empirically the worst, though, I think, of all time in Texas. I mean, there's
right. At Erica Grieder when you tweet that.
And we have, you know, and there's been independent projectors. I mean, there's a couple in Austin who do this kind of work, and they have, you know, you can crunch the numbers. I've done this too. I mean, of course, the budgets are getting bigger over time in the state, so there's a bigger, the margin of error, if it stayed the same, is going to look like a bigger sum.
Right.
But she's been over the mark, under the mark, and I look forward to her retirement, I guess.
Yeah.
Let me jump in on that. If
Yeah,
you don't
Brian,
mind,
do me a favor.
because
Tell us what you think, since Eric apparently is unwilling to. So.
once again, mincing words, being
Right,
very
yeah, yeah,
polite,
right.
not saying what's on our mind.
Right.
Again, regardless of how people think about the list, obviously we're the ones that are ultimately responsible for those legislators who end up on it.
Right.
There is not a single person on the list, either side, any of the categories, to which we didn't see a large consensus among the people that we are talking to in the
So not
Capitol.
just among you
Absolutely
four, but
not.
among...
Now that is to say, we might have a very good friend who says, absolutely this person should be on the best list, which we agree with,
Right.
and then absolutely this person should be on the worst list, which we would disagree with. And so
Right.
there is no unanimity in any of this.
But consensus.
But consensus in the sense that in my mind, I know that people are arguing over the lists already, as they should. It's a list. That's what they're there for. I mean, it's a good thing we're not doing something really important like barbecue, right? I mean, you do something like that, you kind of never see the light of day.
Yeah.
But on something like this, there's not a single pick that we weren't hearing from folks. And the reason why we made the decision, which is unprecedented in the magazine's history, to put the Comptroller on the list, is because of the overwhelming feedback that we were getting from members, both parties, staffers, and people involved in the Capitol. And I think from that you can take from that what you will.
He's gotten better at this, I have to say. Straus, though, let's go back to the speaker. Let's go on to the best list. So you put the speaker on the best list. The temptation is to say history is written by the winners. This was a session in which the speaker set out a series of goals at the beginning, got most of them by the end, said we were going to have a limited number of distractions, had a limited number of distractions, at least until the special now. He pretty much charted the course of the session, and among the three leaders, it seems to be generally accepted, it's not unanimous, but generally accepted, he had the best session of the three leaders.
I think that's absolutely the case.
Yeah.
After Sweany died, I went over to the Westgate where Gordon Johnson has his lair, and visited with him, and Straus walked in. And the very first thing he said was, "We did what we said we were going to do." And I think that's
And in fact, that's part of the write-up that you did for the speaker, and that's pretty much the distillation of why you felt he deserved to be elected. Now, you know that conservatives have a different view of this. In fact, one conservative operative in this community said to me yesterday, it's amazing that Speaker Straus found time to both run the House and also write Texas Monthly's list.
We should hire Josh because he's just that good, right? I mean, that's very fun.
I don't know who you're referring to actually by name.
I got the same
but you know
text, so it's funny.
that your view of the speaker, as you say, may be consensus, but there are certainly conservatives who feel like this was a missed opportunity as a session, that the conservative agenda was not anywhere in evidence in the 140 days, and in fact that there's no conservative influence or agenda on your list. That maybe arguably the most conservative member on your list is Tommy Williams, and even he's already being attacked from the right as he considers entering a comptroller's race.
This just seems like so absurd. I mean, this sudden, Tommy Williams, Republican senator from the Woodlands. I mean, it's like a prima facie conservative, right? I mean, if he's not a conservative, who counts as conservative these days? This kind of sudden emergence of this, what do we even call them? Like super hyper conservative fiscal hawks? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to me. Williams is conservative. I think there's several other conservatives on that list: Senator Duncan, Pitts, Jimmy Don. I mean, these are classic Texas Republicans. They're conservative. I'm perplexed by this.
So, Sonia, do you look at the list as you covered the Senate, and again, Senator Williams, Senator Duncan, both on the best list. Do you look at that list and think there's an adequate number of conservatives, if this is a conservative state, given the preponderance of people who consider themselves conservative in the state, that this list and the byproduct of the session, that this is an accurate reflection of what happened?
I would say that definitely. I think the list has, I don't know,
It has a mix of, as things naturally emerge, there's Democrats and Republicans on both lists. I think that was just what we saw on the ledge this session. And actually, this was a session where you saw, if there were three parties, so to speak, in the House, it was Republicans, Democrats, and then this Tea Party caucus, but the Democrats were the bigger force than the Tea Party caucus in the end, I think.
And think of some of the votes on the Tea Party caucus. When you think of the hard bills in the House, right? think about the budget coming up late. So
Yeah.
think of some of the appropriation bills. What were the votes that the Tea Party caucus was getting consistently? Somewhere between 16, 17, 18, 19 votes. I mean, you sort of had that
Yeah.
group. In my mind, I think that is a good reflection of what are the parameters that we've set out.
Right.
Who are the lawmakers who are addressing the major issues? Public ed, water, transportation.
So to the extent, Paul, that this is a list that is built based on process, the Tea Party didn't necessarily work as well as it needed to within the process of the legislature to get what it wanted to accomplish.
Most of that group was lost. They never found their relevance.
Yeah.
And so Straus was able to wire around it most of the time. But it was always there, it was always lurking, and it was always a problem. They were always having to fight to get their votes, and you really saw that on House Bill 11.
House Bill 11 is where it started in the House. I think
Yeah.
also with Representative Drew Darby's bill, I think that was 3664 on transportation, where he wanted to increase registration fees, something that hasn't been done since 1985. I think those were two cases where you certainly saw that dynamic in play that knocked those bills off. But then I also think, for better or worse, and everybody is going to say either they think that Straus's management style and leadership style was effective or it was ineffective or that it was too hands-off or whatever the case may be. The fact of the matter is they put the ship back together, right? I mean, the HB 11, that happened on a Monday. That was really the first big hiccup on the House side. And it did certainly look like the session was adrift because you had a couple of losses in a row.
Well, and in fact, Paul wrote not terribly kind things about the Speaker's leadership style fairly late into the session,
that's right.
only to kind of whiplash back by the end and say, basically, never mind, the Speaker saved everything.
It's hard to call a ball game in the third quarter, right? So we're sort of doing it at a minute-by-minute, day-by-day, day-by-day.
And in the end, Straus got what he wanted, and the Tea
back
Party
together.
conservatives
Right,
effectively
right,
did not, and
right.
therefore don't find them.
One last thing I'd say about that, and then I'll shut up.
Yeah.
You cannot come into a list thinking that we have slots for people, right? So you can't think that we have lists for, light Rs versus hard Rs, Ds versus Rs, men versus women. You can't do it. If we ended up coming out of the list, best, worst, whatever it is, if we ended up saying that we're holding spots for certain people, the list sort of on its nature is worthless.
Well, let me just
Right.
ask that, because of course, again, I have the disadvantage of inside knowledge from having been involved with this process in the past. You don't sit down and go, oh crap, too many white men, we need some women. Or we need some Hispanics, or we need some Democrats, or some combination of that, so that the list is balanced and so that the reaction to the list is at least more of a reflection of the fullness of the legislature. Because already you're hearing criticism, no African Americans on the best list. Now, peace. You all have your decision-making process, fine. But again, you say there are no slots, but the reality is people automatically assume you must be looking at the list and trying to achieve some kind of balance. You've been doing this the longest.
I got home
Address
yesterday,
that.
phone rings, it's Bill Miller. Do you know there are no African Americans on the best list? Yes, Bill, I know. We don't have quotas, and that was sort of the end of the conversation.
Right. Let me ask you about Naomi Gonzalez and Ron Reynolds. So you tweeted out the list one name at a time, first Naomi Gonzalez and then Ron Reynolds, and I was moved to tweet, is this a worst list or a police blotter? And it's, of course, unfair to Representative Gonzalez and Representative Reynolds, except for the fact that I can't figure out why they made the worst list, except for their problems with the law. They basically didn't do anything during the session that would rise to the level of worst, except they got into trouble with the popo. I can't figure out why you put them on this list, except to basically slap their hands as hard as the law did.
No.
And I've read the write-up. I didn't see substantively very much except, well, they didn't do anything except defend themselves against these charges.
That's not true.
No.
Well, go ahead. Well, then you tell me where I'm wrong.
First of all, is that not a measurement of what we expect from our lawmakers, is to not get in trouble with the popo, right? I mean,
But it's the best and worst legislators, not the best and worst people.
one of the things that happened, and so, for example, in Representative Gonzalez's case, which I think is that's a very problematic, troublesome case.
Yeah.
Not only for what had happened, or what we assumed to have happened, but what could have happened, right? We're coming off of a moment in the legislature where just two weeks ahead of time, we have the Gabriel Nastande verdict coming back, and so there's a lot of talk about these types of incidents, right? One person in the House had told me that at the very, very best, what had happened in that situation is it confirmed what a lot of people say, is that lawmakers from outside of Austin come here for 140 days and they just have fun. It's like summer camp, right? That they don't take it serious. And what we say in that write-up is you cannot, the first rule is you cannot bring shame to the Capitol, to the legislature. And in doing so, I think that you do. To your other point, though, we do write about Representative Gonzalez's actions from a legislative standpoint. We write about two very specific incidents where she's at the front mic talking about bills, and it seems very, very clear, either through the personal troubles that she was going through, and we know that her mother was quite ill, she was dealing with that she was not being an effective representative for the constituents in her district or for Texas at large.
Rises to the level of worst of 10 worst?
Absolutely.
Paul?
Yeah, what Brian said is correct, and it's been true since 1975. You can't bring shame upon the body.
So if I go back and look at everybody who's ever been picked up for some minor or less than or more than minor charge in the legislature over these 21 lists,
Drew Nixon.
every single one of them is on the worst list.
I have no idea that that's
Every
true.
single one of them is on the worst list?
A lot of them are. You know, Drew Nixon.
Well, that was pretty good, the Drew Nixon.
That was actually twice, right?
I'd put Drew Nixon in all 10 slots.
Nixon was on back-to-back,
Right.
right? Again, what I would say about that, too, is that if we were sitting here right now, and Representative Gonzalez, right, or if Representative Gonzalez were not on the list, one of the very first questions that you would ask me is, how on earth did somebody who got into this sort of serious trouble with the law not make it
Well,
on the list?
I'm going to save till the end a very similar question about a different person that's not on the list. Let me ask Sonia about two senators on the best list. You know, we love everybody. We're not going after anybody individually. No disrespect meant to them. But I read the write-ups of both Senator Wendy Davis and Senator Letisa Van de Putte. Nice people, good legislators. And I thought, I still don't understand why this rose to the level of best. I mean, to your point, Paul, you say you don't have quotas. It felt like we don't have enough Democrats. We got to put a couple of Democrats on the list. I'd like you to make the case, please, for why Wendy Davis and why Letisa Van de Putte, as opposed to any number of other Democrats who had pretty good sessions, kept their noses clean, but didn't necessarily accomplish big things.
Well, Wendy Davis came into the session fresh off of a very tough campaign, and she came in with her hackles up, and you saw some of the grandstanding that she had been doing at the end of last session.
And in fact, in the write-up, you mentioned the fact that she did grandstand this session, despite the fact that she's the best.
Yes, but then she sort of got that in check, and you saw her, despite being stripped from her education committee, you saw her going and being the progressive voice when a lot of other people weren't willing to talk. You know, she was basically the only Democrat who was there on vouchers and, you know, pushing back against Patrick and, you know, saying you can't take these dollars.
Well, I think other Democrats in the Senate might say that they also.
Yes, but she was a very consistent voice, and she turned over the course of the session from a show horse to a workhorse, and she. You saw her working. Watson pulled her in to help with the TRS, ERS. She found the $100 million unexpended balance that even Duncan didn't know about. I mean, she works hard, and she had a good session.
Erica, what about Senator Van de Putte?
Well, you know, to the point about quotas, we don't have quotas, of course, but I think one thing we're doing as we're scanning these chambers is keeping an eye out for issues, for regions of the state that might not be at the top of our Twitter feed every day, because of course, being in Austin, there's certain parochial interests. I thought sort of keyed onto Van de Putte early in the session because she had this really small bill that was allowing military families, if you move to the state, to qualify for expedited occupational licensing for you or for your spouse.
Right.
Which is actually a really just smart, thoughtful, dead-on message kind of thing for Texas. It's going to help a lot of military families, especially military wives, because they're often the spouse who comes to the state and has to be out of work for a year or so.
Right.
So I thought that was just, you know, thoughtful, well-crafted, well-designed. It's already been signed. It's a good new law. And then she had, you know, kind of a portfolio of good work this session on military issues, on the human trafficking side, and made some good arguments on the floor on education policy. Not that they were arguments that won or arguments that were dispositive, but just that they were arguments that were different and were thoughtful and were substantive. And
I don't mean this to sound pejorative, but it sounds like you, in her case and maybe in other cases, you are willing to reward small ball as well as large ball, right, as the case may be. In some instances, people may not accomplish enormous things, but over the course of the session, they stack up little wins, and those wins ultimately produce a best?
I mean, I guess maybe Burka could speak to that more than I could because he's done the list so much longer. And I think I would say too, in the Senate side, there are a lot of very effective senators this session, and we probably could have, maybe we had to have a House quota instead of a quota for anything else. I mean, there's plenty of people who could have been honored for doing good work.
Well, in fact, of the 4 Democrats on the list, the only House Democrat was Representative Martinez Fisher. I mean, you obviously found the Senate Democrats relative to the House Democrats to be more effective.
I think that's true.
It's partly scale too. I mean, you see, it's a smaller chamber, and so there's, I think I mean, we could ask them this question, but I think the Senate Democrats have, maybe more latitude to kind of work one-on-one directly with colleagues and to get things through. And you saw a lot of good bills come out that were.
But of course, the flip side of that, Paul, is 55 Democrats in the House. You only found 1 best. Did everybody have to lose weight and keep his temper in check to get on the best list?
Look, Martinez Fisher came further in this session than I think any member of the legislature. It was a complete turnaround.
Yeah.
He had been the bad boy of the session the last time, where he turned the microphone around on the speaker, but then when he had the opportunity to shine on the Transparency Committee, where he went after the secret folks, he was great on that. When they needed somebody to face down the Senate, Martinez Fisher was not on the conference committee, but Brian and I were walking through the East Hall, and here came Pitts, and the rest of the conferees, Darby, there they were, and Martinez Fisher was there, and Pitts turns to me and says, "He's my protection."
Is that right?
Yeah.
So, okay.
Yeah.
Well, when we
I
do a
also
list
think
of
with
best and worst bodyguards, he will be on that best list as well.
I also think with Representative Martinez Fisher, it's a great narrative, right? I mean, I think that it's a great story because he came in, as you say, he was our bull of the Brazos last session, which is not, that is a consequential, meaningful award because you're talking about somebody who had a large impact on what happened, right, on the session. This time he ends up on the best list. But I think even from the very beginning, because there's certainly a level of him that there is some grandstanding that goes on, and there's a lot of talk, and there's some chest puffing that happens. But even early in the session, you think about a bill, HB 10, which was sort of thought about as the first kind of big test as to whether they could get something across the finish line. Who was the Democrat who was handling kind of the back and forth in the negotiations? It was Martinez Fisher. Right. So you saw very early in the session that he was being entrusted with this responsibility, and in our mind, he kind of lived up to it. And that was a steady narrative throughout the entire session, that he was involved as that kind of go-between person, and it was effective. And again, I think in that sense, we saw somebody that we didn't know which direction that he might turn. In our mind, he turned positive. He turned positive.
Let me ask you about a couple people not on the best list before we get to a couple people who are and are not on the worst list. A number of us in the community here thought maybe John Zerwas from Simonton, who made a valiant attempt to address in a conservative way, but to the left of others in the House, the question of Medicaid expansion. Zerwas has been a favorite of this list.
It was the best last session.
For a long time. No Zerwas.
He's an honorable mention.
He's an honorable mention. The compromise that was struck at some point mid-early in the session on women's health funding, variously attributed to either Sarah Davis from West University Place, Republican, or Donna Howard, Democrat of Austin. Donna Howard had as an additional box check that she was valiant in attempting to push unsuccessfully a lot of disclosure and ethics-related legislation. Neither Sarah Davis nor Donna Howard on this list. Can you tell us who the 11th best would have been? Are there people who, I mean, obviously you've got 4 or 5 honorable mentions, Kirk Watson, John Zerwas, Mark Strama, one more I'm forgetting. There are going to be people, obviously, who, like Zerwas, to pick him as example, or Sarah Davis, people will say, well, that just seems like a no-brainer, but yet this person is not there.
Zerwas never has a bad session. Every session is good. This was good. He was constantly having to work against Lois Kolkhorst. They did not get along. They had rival bills and rival ideas, and that was unfortunate. I think.
You also put Lon Burnham on the worst list, and in doing so, you talk about the fact that he kind of got in the way of Zerwas's best intentions with regard to Medicaid, and ultimately made it impossible for the House. You attribute to Burnham not doing anything. Burnham's staff has a different point of view about this, but in any case,
They do.
yeah. But in some ways, Burnham may have kept Zerwas off the worst list if you read the Burnham write-up on. I mean, kept Zerwas off the best list if you read Burnham's write-up on the worst list.
Well, when you had that Amendment 51
Yeah.
that came up, which was really the pivotal moment on expansion. Maybe there was no pivotal moment on expansion. Maybe
Right.
it was never going to happen at all. But that was a moment where if you are a skilled player, Burnham should have stepped back and said, "Here's the ball," because
Right.
the Republicans trusted Burnham,
Republicans
trusted Zerwas,
Yeah.
and didn't trust Burnham.
Erica, let me ask you about Kelly Hancock, moving over to the worst list. I don't think I heard Kelly Hancock's name, again, no disrespect to Senator Hancock. I don't think I heard Senator Hancock's name 3 times during the entire session. Pops up on the worst list. So I'm going, okay, I can't wait to see the write-up, what justifies this. And again, my distillation, you tell me if this is not right, that you object to the fact that on the one hand, Senator Hancock took money from the insurance lobby, but on the other hand, attempted to kill the Office of Public Insurance Counsel. And you find this to be an inappropriate elevation of his personal interest or his fundraising interest sort of in conflict with the public's interest. Is that a fair characterization?
I think that's a good summary of it. I think in this state we have a pretty flexible idea about how the lobby interacts with the legislature, right? And so
Yeah.
if somebody has violated this norm on the part of Texas,
Right.
they've really gone pretty far in the direction of.
Let's assume that Senator Hancock, again, he's not here to defend himself, but let's assume that the characterization that you make of him in this write-up is accurate. How many other members of the legislature are also taking money from the lobby and doing things that, at least on the outside, look to be a little smelly? I mean, we and others in the Tribune spent a lot of time this session banging on ethics, personal financial interest, and conflict with professional interest. I went back and looked. You didn't even put Gary Elkins on the worst list in 2011. And that to me seems like so much more of a slam dunk in terms of Gary Elkins advocating to loosen payday lending restrictions, but yet having strong personal interest in the payday lending business. You didn't even put Elkins on the worst list in 2011, but you put Hancock on the worst list.
In a way, it connects to your point about how you didn't otherwise hear Hancock's name, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Elkins was not really being sneaky about that in 2011. Hancock didn't play a big role in anything productive, and then early on in the session, Burka had spotted the bill coming up on the list, like,
Right.
what is this doing?
I mean, what Hancock did was he dropped in a bill that got rid of the ombudsman, the protections for the public.
Right.
For the Office of Public Insurance Counsel, tried to get rid of the office.
Right.
After having taken all this money.
Can you say that no other member of the legislature this session did anything comparable to what Hancock did?
Try to kill protections for the public? I don't know of anybody else who did that. There are 181 of them. Maybe somebody
So
did.
what Hancock did from your standpoint in terms of ethics and personal financial interest versus professional interest was the worst, or worst enough that it rises to the level of being on the worst
And
list.
again, I think it comes from, you had mentioned Representative Howard and you had mentioned Representative Davis.
Yeah.
We're aware of them as well and had talked about them and
Right.
had talked about them among ourselves and with what reputation is among the colleagues and staffers and within the Capitol. In this particular case in the Senate, this was one that we were hearing about, and that
So
people
others
were-
in the Senate had an issue with
absolutely. And so
Hancock.
again, I mean, I have to be clear that the nature of a list is that everybody has a pile of rocks that they're ready to throw, and we do the same thing with
Right.
anybody else who puts out a list. But the notion that somebody ends up on the list just sort of reflexively because we do it, that's not the case.
But it also may be that a campaign of rock throwing is
Absolutely.
successful.
Oh, of course.
Right?
No-
So that the
no-
people who
no
don't like
question
Kelly
about that.
Hancock may have just thrown the most rocks.
Absolutely. And so at that point, you have to hope that our news judgment is good enough to where we understand
Okay.
where is somebody making a personal case
Right.
and where is somebody making an objective case that we think our readers, people who
Right.
are interested in the welfare of Texas, should know about.
Erica, let me ask you about another senator about whom there's been some discussion since the list came out, and that's Dan Patrick. So Jimmy Don Aycock, chair of House Public Education, gets on the best list for getting HB 5 through. Governor signs HB 5, everyone's dancing in the street, great. Senator Patrick is the chair of the Senate Public Education Committee. HB 5 also, a version of it had to go through the Senate, had to be approved. The cap on charters was lifted, even though it wasn't lifted to the degree that Senator Patrick wanted. He sat up here a couple weeks ago, and you know, I said, I don't think you had the best session in the world. He enumerated for a couple minutes, one sentence, no punctuation, all the things that he did in the area of public. I'm reminded all those years ago of The Prince of Tides, that movie with Barbara Streisand directed that got every Oscar nomination but Best Director, and she said, what, it directed itself? Doesn't Dan Patrick have the right to look at all of you and say, take a look at the education reform we accomplished this session? What, it directed itself?
Well, from what I saw yesterday on Twitter and I guess on Facebook, Senator Patrick has chosen to interpret this worst listing as a badge of honor.
And not only, Harvey Hildebrand came in behind last night. They basically say for a conservative, if you end up on the worst list, it is the absolute best thing to take back to my district.
Which is actually
We're happy to do that for them.
Yeah.
pretty yeah.
I mean, that's you've heard this before. This is not the first time that's been
If I were
I've
on the
heard it a
worst
lot.
list, not to
Sure.
interrupt, that's exactly what I would do. But go ahead. 'cause I think
On
this
the
is
merits,
important.
I
Yeah.
want to make
Right.
the case on the merits for why
Absolutely.
Patrick should have been on the worst list when ACOC was on the best list.
This is, do you want to, yeah, go ahead.
This is exactly how process works.
Well, let's hear it.
It goes down to, you have Jimmy Don running his committee like a statesman, and you have Patrick running his committee like a demagogue. You have Patrick, let's say, hypothetical, let's say you have the chair of criminal justice, and he has the head of the prison system come in and say, you know, your reform that you're trying to do, I feel makes the prison system less safe. And let's say the chair of criminal justice does not let him finish and interrupts him. That's exactly what happened with Michael Williams when he's talking about SB3, the companion to HB5. You know, Patrick, you know, he's saying, I'm sorry, I think that this steps down in rigor. And Patrick just cuts him off and is very rude to him and is acting, you know, basically
So it's the way he comported himself.
yeah, he's just, you know, he somehow thinks he's the education czar, not the head of Senate Education. And he the way he ran his committee and the patronizing way that he, I think, it always tends to, you know, like has tended towards it. Just when he actually gets this position of power, he did not conduct himself
So
well.
this would be probably the best evidence yet that it's process and not outcome, because Senator Patrick could argue that 75, 80%, 85% of what he attempted to accomplish on the education reform agenda actually got accomplished. I mean, Ty Cobb only hit 400. You know, the fact is Patrick hit significantly better as a batting average on the stuff that he attempted to pass.
Then you also look at C-scope, which, you know, by all accounts was a witch hunt. It, you know,
Well, not by all accounts, by your account.
but
I
by
mean,
my account
yeah.
and by the accounts of many people,
Yeah.
it was a system that obviously had some problems, but there was a very loud, vocal base of 2 or 3 people who were very, very upset about it.
Yeah.
And, you know, there are 877 school districts now that are scrambling, trying to find another curriculum system. And, you know, he's doing that in the name of transparency, where, you know, and then you look at the recall effort on SB 346, which, you know, is a transparency bill.
Right.
And you take those things and you look at them together and you think,
Right, but of course, again, from an outcome standpoint, he wanted C-scope gone, C-scope is gone. He wanted to see SB 346 ultimately not be written into law. It ultimately wasn't written into law. He could argue, would argue probably, process schmocess, look what I did.
There's this, you know, this has been kind of a theme, I guess. I mean, it's very often a false dichotomy, right, between process and outcomes. I mean, we see in the ledge, especially in the Senate side, where it's so small and it's historically so collegial, and where they have the 2/3 rule, is that typically if you're good at process, you're going to get better outcomes.
Yeah.
And maybe Patrick is kind of exceptional because, and it's kind of interesting. We had some internal debate about this.
Oh,
pick.
I have no doubt.
And I won't specify who was on which side of this debate, but I think there was a case that, you know, if somebody comes out of a session with a lot of big bills and has been clearly sort of working really hard to get them through, and I actually think Patrick is sincere in his concerns. How does that make you that bad? But then there was this kind of pattern of not being able to have.
That you couldn't disregard. Pardon me.
Yeah, yeah.
Let me ask you about the freshmen. 2 more questions before we open it up for the audience. So I know that, again, not a rule, but a tradition. You don't put freshmen on the list. You had a box this time. Typically, you do Rookie of the Year. You had a box acknowledging 4 freshmen, Jonathan Sticklin and Donna Campbell in the negative, Bennett Ratliff and Charles Schwertner, who I'm obligated to point out is not actually a freshman senator, but not a freshman member, as positives in the freshman category. A lot of people thought, oh, if ever there's a year in which they're going to bust that rule, you know, Sticklin, I mean, if you want to go home to Bedford and wave the magazine around and tell people, I'm on the worst list, this is a badge of honor, we're going to make your day. But you, in fact, declined to put any freshmen on the list. Really, no consideration of that this time? Now, Jonathan Stickland is my homie. I like the guy, so I'm not actually criticizing him. But you guys did not actually think about that?
Well, sure we did. But the problem is when you have 40 of them and they're sort of indistinguishable, you kind of put your finger down.
So this was really a case of you not necessarily seeing one rise or descend, as it were, from the pack.
The group, it was the pack that mattered, and they had an enormous impact on the session. I would say for the worse rather than for the better,
Yeah.
but they did have an enormous impact on the session.
I thought Representative Stickland did an excellent job defending privacy rights of Texans on email and so on. I actually thought he had some good moves there, and I appreciated his influence in the House in that respect, at least.
And I think all of us who watch this stuff, he made it interesting. There's no question
I think
about
that's
that.
absolutely an important bill. I don't have any doubt about that. I think that there was, what's the word, reputation that developed, particularly around Representative Stickland. It started very early when they were debating the rules package, where he had put an amendment up that every bill that you filed had to cite the kind of constitutional authority to which you could write that particular bill.
Yeah.
And I think there were moments then where the House leadership, sort of various people, would kind of knock that down. I think our sense is that part of what this list does, I hope part of what this list does, is it reflects a notion of power, right? That to get on the best list or the worst list, there has to be some level of power. Now, you've pointed out in Representative Gonzalez's case that's not exactly right, but I think that there's a different threshold there that we're measuring. And in this sense, I'm not sure that any of those freshmen had the power to sort of move the ball one
Didn't
way or
really
the other.
matter enough to end up on
and
one
didn't have
side or
any
the other.
sort of continually egregious moments that would put them on the worst list, or
Right.
moments where they sort of really shine. Now, obviously, we're aware that Senator Schwartner is
Not actually.
but
He's
is
a red
freshman.
shirt freshman. Isn't there
Red
some
shirt freshman.
sports term you can use to it?
But there are also, we couldn't address them all. 41 freshmen in the House, 5 plus an open seat in the Senate. And
Although not all true freshmen.
but again, yes, thank you. Donna Campbell, the only true freshman in the Senate. But
And Sylvia Garcia.
That was the open seat, that's right. But I think that as you're sort of sizing that up and looking at it, you did have, and I think this will be the thing that you look for in the next session, those who come back, who are the ones that really rise. And I think that we saw somebody like Jason Villalba, who's a Republican from Dallas, I think had an outstanding session. Right. Gene Wu, somebody who's a Democrat from Houston, had an outstanding session. Right. And so we'll be keeping our eyes on them. But I think by and large, not sure. I think the jury is still out.
Let me say the last question for you, because again, I want to end where I began. I want to go back and read one more time that sentence. Success in politics is all about how well one plays with others. Who is fair, who is trustworthy, __. Who offers help to his colleagues. Where the hell is Ryan Guillen on the worst list? When you consider what happened at the end, if I looked at this list and I thought, if anybody is missing from this list who seemed like a no-brainer based on your own criteria, it was Ryan Guillen, who in the end had promised the body that he would do one thing, went over into conference, came back, not only didn't do what he said he was going to do, but expanded the wrong that the body rose up against to begin with, and was basically shamed and shouted down by the other 149 members from the back mic. And I thought, well, that's obvious, duh, Ryan Guillen's going to be on the worst list. Not even a dishonorable mention. What happened?
You're talking there about the CHL bill that
I
will come
am.
back.
And again, just on the basis of,
Yeah.
no offense to Representative Guillen, but on your own criteria. Sure. Who is trustworthy? What member of the House could ever trust Ryan Guillen again?
10 members on the best list, 10 members on the worst list, 181 members. I mean, if we had 11, 12, 13, you would ask who is slot 14 and
But he's
15.
not even on the dishonorable mention.
That's right. But again, there are a lot of people. I mean, I think that we could make the case that there are a lot of people. At a certain point, as we kind of come together and we talk about it, names don't make it, that I think you could make a reasonable case for people being on
Can
it.
you tell me why?
I don't think Guillen was a major player this session. He did almost nothing.
But Ron Reynolds and Naomi Gonzalez, I mean, again, sorry to pick back at this scab, but Ron Reynolds and Naomi Gonzalez were major players?
Not a
Ron
scab
Reynolds
to me.
was arrested for a felony in 2 different counties.
So he was good at it, actually, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is Ryan Guillen a model citizen? No. Did the issue in which he was involved really rise to one of those things where you could say this is, this is one of the key issues of the session? No. Guillen has made his mark over the years. His getting a bill on major state in the Craddock era was probably one of the turning points of the Craddock speakership. But I just don't, and I never saw Guillen as a major force in the session for good or bad.
Okay. All right, well, let's leave it there. Let's give these four a hand. Thank you very much for answering those questions.